Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. My wife and I spent 9 glorious years in this area, and I haven't been back in a while, and this is my 6th talk in 3 days, the last before I have to go to Los Angeles. But it's really wonderful to end this trip here at such a wonderful venue in an extraordinary place. So thank you for coming out tonight. So I have just one sacred text. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil. Henry David Thoreau, 1846, on Walden. There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the roots. So imagine a letter written by a young woman. There were 2 clocks regulating our life, the one on the wall and the one in the bottle. We built our life around those clocks. He slept late, so mornings were bliss. We could play and laugh without fear. But at some point he would awake, and soon after he woke, the bottle was opened, and then the older the day grew, the more terrifying life became. He was happy at first. Just before dinner, the most happy. That's the only time I spoke to him. A moment to pretend I had a father who had a feeling of love. He'd smile. He'd laugh, but soon he'd grow irritated, and by the end of dinner he was angry, and if we were not gone, usually just hiding in our room, by 9 he would be violent. And he hit me more than once. Once he tried to do something worse than hitting me, and I left, and I never went back. We struggled to do many things then in that house. We struggled to keep food in the house, to keep the winter out of the house, to keep the house. But we never even spoke about getting him to stop. I don't know why. The bottle was just part of our life. We learned to live with it. Anything more just seemed impossible. Now, the thing about us humans, is that we learn to adapt. We learn to adjust. We learn to live with it until we can't. And then a certain fever breaks out, and if we're lucky, we have a Thoreauvian insight. We learn to stop hacking at branches of evil. We learn to strike at the root. We learn to become a root striker. So here's my argument. I think there's a feeling today among too many Americans that we just might not make it. Not that the end is near or that doom is around the corner, but that a distinctly American feeling of inevitability, of greatness, culturally, economically, politically, is gone. That we have become Britain or Rome or Greece. A generation ago, Ronald Reagan rallied the nation to deny a similar charge by Jimmy Carter's fear that we had fallen into a state of malaise. And I confess I was one of those so rallied, and I still believe Reagan was right. But the feeling I'm talking about today is different. Not that we as a people have lost anything of our potential, but that we as a republic have. That our capacity for governing, the product of a constitution we have revered for more than 2 centuries, has come to an end. That the thing we were once most proud of, this, our republic, is the one thing we all have learned to ignore. Government is an embarrassment. It has lost the capacity to make the most essential decisions. And slowly it dawns upon us that a ship that cannot be steered is a ship that will sink. This is not a Democratic or Republican point. This is a multi-partisan frustration. The view that this government doesn't work is fed by many cues on both the left and the right as policies get blocked, systematically blocked, in ways that each side recognizes. And when that happens, we need a practice, a skill, to seek for this Thoreauvian root. So my objective is to brainwash you a little bit tonight about what that Thoreauvian root might be. I'm going to give you some examples. So the first begins with the life I had before I started this work. I focused in the area of copyright. On October 27th, 1998, I became a copyright activist when Bill Clinton signed into law a statute honoring this great American, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. Now, this was a statute that extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. And the question Congress was to ask when it passed the statute was, did it advance the public good to extend the term of existing copyrights by 20 years? Now, a copyright is supposed to work by giving people an incentive to create great new work. We give you a monopoly. You get that monopoly in exchange for creating great new work. But the thing about incentives in this universe, maybe not Star Trek's universe, but this universe, is that incentives are prospective. Not even the United States Congress can get George Gershwin to produce anything more. So it's obvious that extending the term of an existing copyright is not going to increase any incentives. The works has already been created. So when we challenged this statute in the Supreme Court, we had a brief signed by 13 economists, including 5 Nobel Prize-winning economists, including this leftist economist. Wait, I'm sorry, that's Milton Friedman, right-wing Nobel Prize-winning economist, who said he would only join the brief if the word no-brainer was in the brief. So obvious was it that extending the term of an existing copyright could not advance the public good. But apparently there were no brains in this place when Congress unanimously extended the term of the existing copyright. What there was more than $6 million in campaign contributions from the Disney Corporation and related companies, all eager to see their copyright extended, the public good be damned. Here's another example. Think about Wall Street. We've just seen extraordinary collapse in our economy triggered by a collapse on Wall Street. What explains that collapse? Well, according to Simon Johnson and James Quack in this really great book, what explains it is a kind of perverse mix of both too little government and too much government. Too little government in the form of deregulation. Of course, in the 1990s, the financial innovators innovated in extraordinary ways in producing new financial instruments, primarily what we call derivatives. But different, those innovations were invisible to the market because a series of regulatory changes begun in the 1990s deregulated those financial instruments and made it so they did not have to satisfy the standard rules, exchange-based rules that applied to every other financial instrument since the New Deal. Exchange-based rules that required trades be on a public exchange, transparent, and subject to anti-fraud requirements. So in 1980, my colleague Frank Partner calculates 98% of assets traded were traded subject to those New Deal rules. But by 2008, 90% of the assets traded in our economy were exempted from those New Deal rules. Traded without any transparency requirement, traded not on any public exchange. Nobody knew anything about what there was in this economy. It was a shadow banking economy which encouraged the bubble, which when it burst brought our economy down. But Johnson and Quack say that alone isn't enough to explain this. In addition, you've got to see how there was too much government. Throughout the 1990s, the government sent a clear beacon to Wall Street that there was, in effect, a government guarantee so that when this bubble burst, there would be, in effect, a bailout on the other end, producing the dumbest form of socialism ever invented by man. We socialized the risk, but privatized the benefit. They got the upside, we paid the downside. Now, I apologize, I understand this isn't a room of lawyers, and this is a technical legal term, but this is an insanely stupid way to set up a financial market. And all of that stupidity is the one before 2008. It gets worse after 2008. We have the insult here added to injury. Because after 2008, after we had suffered the worst financial crisis since the Depression, after all who were independent of Wall Street had concluded that a significant cause of that crisis was the misregulation of Wall Street, After the dean of deregulation, the Ayn Randian Alan Greenspan, testified to Congress that he had been, quote, mistaken in his assumption that the banks would act in the public interest rather than in their own private interest. All of that, after all of that, Wall Street still had the power to blackmail our Congress into giving them effectively a get-out-of-jail-free card and not changing at all the basic architecture that led to the instability that brought our economy over the cliff. If the banks were too big to fail in 2008, they've only become too bigger to fail after 2008 because of the, quote, financial reform that we have passed since 2008. Now, what explains the consistent inability of us to regulate sensibly in this context? Well, there are lots of possible answers, but here's the one thing we can point to with confidence. Since the 1990s, the fastest growing sector for campaign contributions has been the financial and securities sector, and in the 2010 election, the largest sector of contributions to Congress's campaigns came from finance and the insurance industry. Or one more example here. I'm sure many of you, when you saw these horrible images of the Deepwater Horizon, thought to yourself, how is it exactly that such an experimental drilling technology could be launched without extensive environmental impact and risk studies? I mean, after all, where I come from, we've just spent 9 years and 10,000 pages of environmental impact studies to allow us to build this clean energy technology. So exactly what was required before they were permitted to drill this experimental Deepwater Horizon platform? And the answer here is 17 pages of environmental impact analysis before it was exempted from any further obligation to demonstrate its safety. Now, when Congress heard this, Congress was, of course, shocked.
I'm shocked to find the gambling is not in there. So, thank you very much. Everybody on the punch.
Yet, of course, it had been Congress that had required these fast-track approval processes. And why did Congress do that? Well, lots of possible reasons, but the one thing we know is the endless campaign cash that drove to that conclusion. Now, here's the point. No respectable liberal or libertarian or conservative could defend these cases. Each of them is an abomination from each of these three theories of government. So how is it that these abominations become our law? Now, political scientists are a little uncertain. They say the politics is complex. But here's the thing we can be certain of. You believe you know. All I had to do is to point to money, and you believe you know the root cause of the craziness in each of these cases. And my claim is, number one, it is because of cases like this that Americans believe, quote, money buys results in Congress. In a poll we conducted for this book, 75% of Americans said money buys results in Congress. A few more Democrats than Republicans, but I can guarantee when the Democrats controlled Congress, the numbers were just reversed. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here is the one thing we all agree about as Americans, that money buys results in Congress. And that leads to number two. This belief erodes trust in our institution. So Gallup calculated last year that 11% of Americans have confidence in Congress. Things are a little bit better according to Gallup. This year it was 12%. New York Times this morning reported this morning that now it's only 9% of Americans have confidence in Congress. We should put this in some context. It's certainly the case that there were more Americans who believed in the British Crown at the time of the Revolution than who believe in our Congress today. And that leads to number three. Low trust in this institution erodes participation. So Rock the Vote, the youth organization that registers and turns out people to vote, and turned out the largest number of young people to vote in the last presidential election, quite plausibly handing the election to Barack Obama, found that in 2010, many of their members were not going to vote, so they polled them. They wanted to know why. And the number one reason by far, 2-1 over the second highest reason, was, quote, no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids. Vast majority did not vote in this last election, at least in part because of precisely this belief. Now, here's where I shift into law professor mode. Here's my blackboard. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Framers of our Constitution gave us, as conservatives like to remind us, a republic. But what they meant by a republic was a representative democracy. And what that meant, according to Federalist 52, was a democracy with a branch that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. Right, so here's a model of government. We have the people, we have the government. I do my own slides. That's really cool, the way that bounces, right? Okay. People and the government, this marionette relationship, dependency, clear, simple, and exclusive. But the problem is Congress has evolved a different dependence, not a dependence upon the people, increasingly a dependence upon the funders. As members of Congress spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power, they, like all of us would, develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters as they constantly adjust their views, not about the top 10 issues, but issue 11 to 500, in light of what they know will raise the money. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to the House, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. And then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. Now the point is, this is a dependence too. A dependence too. But it's a different and conflicting dependence from the dependence upon the people alone, because, surprise, surprise, the funders are not the people. Indeed, if you're ever inside congressional elections, you recognize that the funders who have the real attention of the candidates are those that max out in contributions. So in 2010, what percentage of Americans maxed out? 2010, 0.05% of Americans maxed out in at least one cycle in the congressional election campaign contributions. 0.05%. So the Occupy Wall Street people are really proud of their slogan, we are the 99%. Bad marketing, bad marketing. They are the 99.95% who have no equivalent access to the 0.05% merely because the 0.05% are the most significant, most reliable, most important funders of campaigns. Now this is, Supreme Court doesn't get this yet, but they will eventually, this is corruption. It's not the corruption of money secreted in brown paper bags to members of Congress. That was, of course, the problem in the 19th century. And through much of the 20th century, members of Congress had safes in their office. You think, geez, I didn't know they paid members of Congress in cash. They didn't. It's just members of Congress would find bags of cash on their desk, and they needed a place to keep it safe, so they put it in their safes in their desk. But that kind of corruption is long gone from our federal government. In that sense, our federal government is the cleanest Congress that we have ever had. I'm not talking about any criminal activity here. All of the corruption I'm talking about is perfectly legal. This is not a problem of multiple Rob Blagojeviches racing around Capitol Hill. This is a corruption because it's a corruption of the intended dependence our framers had. They intended this dependence, that dependence has been perverted, and it is therefore dependence corruption because we have the wrong dependence inside of our core democratic institution. So what does this corruption do? Well, we can think about it in two dimensions. One is substance. So exactly how does the money bend the results? And I know you're going to be a little impatient with this, but it turns out this is controversial among academics. Many wonder whether we can actually show that money affects the results. Many believe maybe we don't have to worry because though there's billions spent in lobbying and billions in campaign contributions, we didn't have good data to demonstrate that it actually changes any results. So the former chairman of the Federal Elections Commission, talk about fox guarding the henhouse, former chairman of the Federal Elections Commission, Bradley Smith, in a debate with me, said this: "The evidence is pretty overwhelming that the money does not play much of a role in what goes on in terms of legislative voting patterns and legislative behavior. The consensus about that among people who have studied it is roughly the same as the consensus among scientists that global warming is taking place." Now, this former chairman of the Federal Election Commission is not a global warming denier. He is a corruption denier. And I was so astonished when he said this, I had to tweet in the middle of the radio show, and then I got in trouble for my hashtag, but that just means Bradley Smith. That's all that stands for. That. Okay, so then what is the evidence that the results are being driven by the money? Well, there's an increasing range of statistical evidence that's demonstrating exactly why we should believe, because we have the numbers, what we believe, because we're all humans, that the money is driving the results. So my favorite recent study is Clayton Peoples, who put together 7,000 different votes and was able to conclude that there was a statistically significant contributor influence in 7 of the 8 houses that he studied between 1991 and 2006. The one house where he couldn't find it was the one house that passed the McCain-Feingold Campaign Reform Act. But more interesting to me is this study by Martin Gylens, a professor at Princeton. So Gylens collected 1,700 surveys of attitudes of Americans about what the government should do. And he picked out of those 1,700, 887, where the top 10% of Americans, the richest 10%, had a view about what America should do that was different from the bottom 90%. So the top 10 wanted us to go one way, the bottom 90 wanted us to go the other way. And then he asked the question, what happens when the top 10 want us to go one way and the bottom 90 want us to go the other way? What policy does the government adopt? And what he found was, when Americans with different income levels differ in their policy preferences, actual policy outcomes strongly reflect the preferences of the most affluent, but bear virtually no relationship to the preferences of the poor or middle-income Americans. There is a vast discrepancy, he describes, between what the government would be doing if it were following the will of the people and what the government does given it follows the will of the tiny selection of people who happen to fund our campaigns. Now you might think, well, the wealthy are just the educated. And I'm sorry to disappoint you. It turns out the wealthy are not the most educated. The most educated are not the most wealthy. As a professor, it's a sad fact to confess. But so we're not talking about the wise policymakers or the people who know something about what should happen. We're talking about the people with the most influence because they have the most wealth that gets diverted into a political system where wealth is power. Okay, that's substance, but think about agenda, because Bradley Smith also said that there's no evidence that affects legislative behavior. And this, I think, is completely baseless. So here's just one example. If I asked you, what was the #1 issue that Congress addressed in the first 4 months of this year? Right? We're in the middle of 2 wars, huge unemployment problem, huge budget deficit issue. We still haven't addressed global warming at all. We have lots of questions about healthcare to work through. So what was the issue they spent most of their time on? No, not abortion. They spent most of their time on the bank swipe fee controversy. Bank swipe fee controversy dominated the congressional agenda. Now, what is the bank swipe fee controversy? Well, when you use your debit card, if you use a debit card, the banks charge a certain amount every time you swipe it. And the fight was whether that amount could go up or whether it had to go down. Really critical issue of national importance. I mean, to those 2 interests, the banks and the retailers, but to America, not very important really at all. So what explains Congress directing their attention to that rather than unemployment or any of these other issues? Well, as a senator commented anonymously, he was too embarrassed to say this publicly, for the article written by Zach Carter and Ryan Grimm for the Huffington Post, quote, "The fights down here can be put into 2 or 3 categories. the big greedy bastards against the big greedy bastards, the big greedy bastards against the little greedy bastards, and in some cases even the other little greedy bastards against the other little greedy bastards. This is the dynamic of how Washington works, and here's the critical money quote. I don't even think that they quite realized how significant it was when they wrote it. The clock never ticks down to zero in Washington. 1 year's law is the next year's repeal target. Politicians showered with cash from card companies and giant retailers alike have been moving back and forth between camps, paid handsomely for their shifting allegiances. And it slowly dawns on you this kind of terrifying recognition, which is obvious once you see it. The agenda of what Congress pays its attention to is driven, at least in part, by the recognition of what issues will flush the most money into the political campaign process. So why don't we deal with unemployment? Turns out unemployment doesn't pay so well in that way. Okay, now I think we need to change this. I think we need to fix this dependence. If the problem here is that the funders are not the people, the solution is a system to make the funders the people. The solution is to give them a way. That's two words. I don't mean give Congress a way. I mean give Congress a way. Give them a way to fund without Faust, to fund without selling their soul, and thereby alienating America. And one way, and increasingly I think the only way to do this, is to finally commit to publicly funding public elections. Yeah. Now, there are lots of flavors of public funding, but the one I want to push here is one that tries to substitute large dollar funded campaigns with small dollar funded campaigns. And we have examples and experiments of this in the states. Arizona and Maine and Connecticut all have small dollar funded systems for their state legislatures. These are systems where candidates opt into a contract where they take small dollar contributions only, but those small contributions are then amplified by the state to make it possible to fund their campaigns in a way that makes them competitive without ever asking for the large contributions that otherwise they would have to request. And there are many ways to do this. In my book, I introduce a slight variation on this. Of course, it's much better than the other ones, but here it is. Let me lay it out for you here. I call it the Grant and Franklin's Project. So the way the Grant and Franklin Project works is you first have to stipulate that every voter in America contributes at least $50 to the federal treasury, whether it's through income tax or gasoline tax or sales tax or wage tax or tax on employment. All of these are ways in which we contribute to the treasury. All of us at least contribute 50. All right, so under this plan, we rebate the first $50 that you contribute in the form of a democracy voucher. You get a democracy voucher for $50. And with that democracy voucher for $50, you can give it to candidates for Congress. And candidates can accept it and spend that money if they agree to limit their source of funds to democracy vouchers and contributions of up to $100 per citizen. So they have two ways to get money, democracy vouchers or $100 contributions. I steal that from Buddy Romer's $100 limit. If people don't allocate their voucher, then the money goes to the political parties, or if they're not allied with a political party, then back to the system to support democracy functions. But the thing to think about here is if it's $50 per voter, that's $6 billion in an election cycle. The total amount raised and spent in 2010 was $1.8 billion. So this is real money that is made available in a way that requires no candidate ever to ask for large contributions again. Now, whether it's my system or the Maine system or another version of this like the Fair Elections Now Act, here's the thing to consider. If we had a Congress where members, the vast majority of members, funded their campaigns with small dollar contributions only, then we could believe, as we all want to believe, that when Congress did something stupid, it might be because there are too many Democrats or too many Republicans or because they don't know anything about what they're talking about, but not because of the money. because this essential component to the cynicism of our current view of Congress would have been removed, and we would have an ability to view their actions on the merits and criticize their actions on the merits. Now, this is a way, I believe, to address the competing dependencies and to restore a single dependency and possibly to restore some of the confidence so our Congress is liked at least as much as King George. Okay, now, that's the argument. Here's the hard part. How do we get there? Because I don't think it's hard to see the problem. You all believed you saw the problem before you came in tonight. And I don't think it's hard to describe a solution to the problem. I've done a little bit here and much more in the book. What's hard, and maybe impossibly hard, is to imagine the political movement that brings about this reform. And the reason that is so hard was signaled to me in a conversation I had with an extraordinary congressman, Jim Cooper, Democrat from Tennessee, a man who's been in Congress as long as all but about 20 other members of Congress. In the interview, he said to me, the problem with Congress now is that Capitol Hill has become a, quote, farm league for K Street. K Street, the street where lobbyists live. And his point is that members and staffers and bureaucrats have an increasingly common business model. A business model focused on their life after government, their life as lobbyists, where they will be paid 2 to 3 to 4 times the amount they get paid as a government servant. So Public Citizen calculated between 1998 and 2004, 50% of members of the Senate left to become lobbyists, 42% of members of the House. Those numbers have only grown. So this is a system where everybody depends on the currently corrupt system surviving so that they have a future after their time as a government servant ends. And so the question is, in a world where they all depend on the system surviving, how are we ever going to change this system? So again, in my book, I outlined 4 ideas. One of them is the ordinary idea, a statute passed by Congress, creating something like the democracy voucher system I set up. And I'm sorry to say, the more I think about this, the more I think that the ordinary strategy, the conventional game, is just impossible. That this entity is not about to radically change the way in which it lives and does its business and protects its future. So that forces me to begin to consider 3 insane ideas for how we might bring about this change. And I think these are actually only improbable, not impossible. And the third of these ideas, the one that I think ultimately might be the most effective, is to use the strategy our framers had for dealing with precisely this problem. In the Constitution, Article 5 describes how the Constitution gets amended. And the ordinary way to amend is that Congress proposes amendments, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify the amendment. But the question was asked at the convention, what if Congress is the problem? They're not going to propose an amendment to fix themselves, so what do we do? And the answer was, we'll create an alternative path for amending the Constitution. So this alternative path gives the states the power to say to Congress, you must constitute a convention. And the convention's job is simply to propose amendments, which themselves have to be passed in the same way with 3/4 of the states ratifying the amendment. So 38 states, meaning 13 states can block any amendment, and in our country there are plainly 13 solid red states and 13 solid blue states, meaning the only amendment that could ever get through this process is one that had broad-based universal support. But the thing about all 3 of these insane ideas is that they are all ways around what is now, I think we should see, the cancer that is at the center of our government, that makes it impossible for that entity itself to address the problems in a way it ordinarily was intended to address. And this is the key here. I think we've entered a time when we have to recognize ordinary means are not appropriate in extraordinary times. Instead, what we need now is the capacity to do something that we've actually not done in a very long time. To build a politics that is different from this politics, that is different from a passive, consuming politics that listens to the commands on a television broadcast and reacts, Instead, an active and engaged politics where we reclaim the politics for ourselves away from the control of the professional politicians. Now, I don't actually think we know whether we have the capacity to do that. Not a lot of evidence that we can do it. So professionalized has our politics become, so cynical have we become in reaction to that professional politics, that it's hard to imagine how we actually motivate the broad-based reaction against that. But I do think we know how that politics starts. And it starts first with a certain kind of clarity. The clarity of Thoreau, the clarity of the route striker. So it might not be surprising that Occupy Seattle is the Occupy movement with the coolest website. All sorts of social tools to organize people and do stuff. And they have this demand section of their website, which lists all the demands that Occupy Seattle is interested in pursuing. And they're going to vote to see which are the most important, but literally hundreds of demands, from protect the environment to my favorite, end the industrial prison complex, which is important to many states like California too, but one of a list of hundreds. Now, I think the clarity that's required here needs to cue us to an obvious fact, that this list, this endless list, is noise to the political process. That we have to find a way to focus these demands in a way that can connect with the widest range of Americans. And that happens by us first celebrating the diversity of America and our political views, recognizing there are people on the left and people on the right, and nothing we should do should demand anybody give up their principles. And as someone from the left, as a liberal, I in particular insist we not compromise on our principles. We've seen nothing but compromise about our principles for the last 30 years, and that's enough. No more compromising. But without compromising on our principles, we can see whether there is common ground among people with very different views. We can see whether, despite not having a common goal, we all might have a common enemy. Indeed, if we want to speak for the 99%, that's a very high bar to cross, to be able to say something that the 99% actually all could stand up and say, yes, I agree with you. I think this requires almost a kind of exercise. Imagine getting people together and saying, okay, we on the left believe these things. And then another group says, we on the right believe these things. But then can we describe the things that all of us believe? The things that all of us believe are problems that we must address, distinct from the things we on the left and the right believe, but that define us as Americans. And my belief is that if we focused that inquiry in that way, and got people to reflect on all the issues that drive them nuts on the left and the right, and get them to begin to connect the dots between those very different issues and ask, what is it that's explaining the frustration in all of these issues? Whether it's healthcare for the left or government bailouts for the right, whether it's global warming for the left or complex tax systems for the right, whether it's financial reform for the left or financial reform for the right, whatever the issue is, we can get them to see that there is here a root cause to the frustration that all of us are feeling. And the root cause is this picture. The root cause is a democracy or a republic where the people are no longer the intended beneficiary exclusively, where the government is no longer exclusively dependent upon them. If we can become root strikers in this process, focusing on this underlying cause and getting the people to see it, then I think there's hope for motivating a movement that is much more than the factions that now seem to define these extraordinarily important populist movements that we see breaking out all across the country. That's number one, clarity. Number two, maybe equally important, is courage. So my friend Arnold Hiatt is a very shy man. He lives in Boston. This is the biggest picture I have found of him on the internet. He was the president of Stride Rite. They make great shoes like Keds. He's also a loyal Democrat. In 1996, he was the second largest contributor to the Democratic Party. So in 1997, Bill Clinton invited him and 30 other large contributors to a dinner at the Mayflower Hotel, a dinner for these fat cats to sit there and tell the president what the president should be doing for the remaining 4 years of his term. And we don't have pictures of the events, but I kind of envision it sort of like this. Arnie is the last one to stand up and talk, and he stands and looks the president straight in the eye. And he says, "Mr. President, I know you're an admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So I want you to put yourself in Roosevelt's shoes in 1940, when Roosevelt reluctantly came to recognize that he needed to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Because he said, Mr. President, you too must convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Not a war against fascists, but a war against a system that privileges fat cats. A war against a system where the rich believe merely because they are wealthy, they are entitled to direct government policy. Merely because they're successful in the market, they have the right to have dinner with the president. People who have convinced America that democracy does not work. I want you to think a little bit about the kind of courage it would take to say that among your friends and the president, and imagine the silence that was greeted Arnie as he finished, and people with a little bit of discomfort shuffling in their seats. And the president stood up and spoke, and as the only recorded account characterizes it, Clinton's response effectively slashed Hiatt to pieces, humiliating him in front of the group. Now, 14 years later, I think it's time we all recognize that it was Arnold Hiatt that night who was right, that we do need to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war, no guns, but a war to save democracy. But where Arnold Hiatt was wrong was in his belief that it would be politicians that would wage that war. It's not going to be politicians. It's going to be citizens. It's going to be us. It's going to be root strikers. It's going to be you. It's our job. It requires our courage. For it's our republic here that has been lost. Ours, not theirs. They took it away, but we let them take it away. I'm going to end with one more story. I'm sure most of you remember this tragic event in 1989 when a ship under the command of Captain Joseph Hazelwood ran aground in the Prince William Sound and dumped 11 million gallons of oil into the ocean. This is Captain Hazelwood calling in the disaster. If you want, so you're notified over. I'm sure many of you are wondering, a question that was asked immediately after the event, was Captain Hazelwood intoxicated when he was captaining a supertanker? He said he had only had 4 vodkas before he got on the ship. His blood level alcohol indicated he must have been at least 6 times the legal limit when he got on the ship. There was a huge fight. His lawyers said he wasn't intoxicated. In fact, they concluded that they didn't have enough evidence to find him intoxicated, so he was not convicted. So let's say there was doubt about whether he was drunk. What there was no doubt about was that he had a problem with alcohol. His mother testified he had a problem with alcohol. 1985, 4 years before the accident, Exxon treated him for his alcohol problem. After the accident, Exxon's president said they thought he had mastered the problem, but in 1986, his driver's license was revoked for a DUI, and in 1988, his driver's license was revoked for a DUI. At the time he was captaining a supertanker, he was not allowed to drive a VW Beetle. Right. Now, forget for a moment Captain Hazelwood. I want you to think about those around him. I want you to think about the other officers, the people who could have picked up a phone. While a drunk was driving a supertanker, I want you to think about the people who did nothing. What do we think about them? Because I ask this question because the more I think about where we are, the more I think we are they. Our nation faces these critical problems requiring serious attention, but we have institutions incapable of that attention, distracted, unable to focus. And who is to blame for that? Who is responsible? It's too easy to point to the Rod Blagojeviches, to the evil people, and hold them responsible. Of course they're responsible for part. But more important are the good people, the decent people, the people who could have picked up a phone, us. We, the most privileged, are responsible. Because the most outrageous part of the story I've told tonight is that while the corruptions here were primed by the most privileged, they were also permitted by the passivity of the most privileged as well. Permitted. When Franklin was carried from the Constitutional Convention in 1787, he was stopped on the streets of Philadelphia by a woman who said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" And Franklin replied, "A republic, madame, if you can keep it." A republic, a representative democracy, a democracy dependent upon the people alone. We have lost that republic. And all of us have to act now to get it back. Thank you very much.